Welcome back once again to Global.Science, our podcast on science education. I'm Lev Hordisky.
I'm Fabia Battistuzzi.
And today's question is, Fabia, are you into politics?
Not really, mostly because being Italian, we learn very early on that politics is something that is better to ignore because politicians do whatever they want anyway and they don't listen to us. So that's pretty much has been my experience in politics. But I've always been kind of curious about the fact that it seems like in general, most politicians have either a very strange or almost no requirements to become politicians. And so in a lot of cases, you have these politicians that make these very important decisions, especially when it comes to science policies, and they don't really understand the science. They can't because they don't have the background. And this sadly doesn't happen only with science. So politics is something that is frustrating, extremely important, but also extremely frustrating to me.
And now you have the American politics mixed on top of that because you're an American now.
Yes, which means now I need to actually start reading up on various candidates and actually making decisions, which I didn't have to do for the past 10 years. So that's going to be interesting to see because it's a very different mechanism, the American politics compared to the Italian one.
How does it compare?
Well, the idea that there are two major parties, the independents, what I gathered is that the independents, nobody really cares about them that much. So there are
the what now?
major,
the what now?
The independent party. What?
Who?
Exactly. So yeah, the fact that there are two major parties and the candidates align with the parties, it's kind of odd to Italians because in Italy, well, when I was in Italy, we are used to have, 10, 20, 30 parties, and they all get a little bit of votes, and then they have to create these giant coalitions that then fall apart in matters of a few months. So it's a very, very different system.
So now the question is, since this is a science education podcast, why are we talking about politics?
Well, that's what our guest is going to tell us all about.
Excellent, that is true. And our guest today is Dr. Tara Lennon, my co-collaborator on the GreenWorks project at Science Voices. She is a senior lecturer in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Welcome to the show, Tara.
So happy to be with both of you. Thanks for having me on.
All right, excellent. We're starting the show already with sarcasm. So we've been working together for many years. So, it's curious why we're working together because I'm an earth scientist and you do public policy. So why are we working together?
I won you in a grant. It was so great.
Oh, that's true. I was the prize.
It was a surprise. I had this weird class, this diplomacy simulation class where I broke students into groups of fictitious nations of different ideological, bents, and then I'd throw them through a bunch of simulated events there where they'd have to make some kind of collective action solutions, creative solutions on their own. So I wanted to, the class was fun, but I knew it could be better. And so I applied for a grant to digitize or gamify what was already sort of interactive class. And so the prize was having Lev as an instructional designer and his computer programming sort of team work with me. And it was a great collaboration because I thought I specialized in pedagogy, but I learned a lot about teaching through discovery through Lev's group.
Yeah, and I think I remember. Yeah, go ahead.
I just said it sounds wonderful. Not the working with Lev part, but the gamifying part.
I remember
his ideas was good.
I remember looking through the projects, and this was the one I liked because I had gotten into politics and international diplomacy a long time ago as kind of a side interest. And I know in a lot of conferences we had been getting into how to talk to politicians about your science because there were a lot of decisions that were being made that were disregarding scientific expertise. And I just remember looking at some of your scenarios, the climate change scenario, and your climate change scenario was, oh, the canal on this continent is going to get flooded. And I was like, oh, we can make this so much worse.
Yeah, because eventually, I mean, entire military bases were wiped out and cities were evacuated with, sort of riots, and military needed to be brought in. So yes. Yeah.
I did a number on your fictitious continent.
Yes. And the students could see it. What I loved about that digital interface is they could see their borders, cities, et cetera, and then Lev's simulation, sort of the digital side of climate change. He'd sort of fast forward and say, well, thanks to all your polluting energy, now, here are your borders, here's your lost, cities, here's your salinated farmlands that no longer can give you economic benefit because all these resources were sort of operational parts within it. And yeah, he just wiped them out. So students would see the potential impact of the energy policies, and he'd let them practice in a sense, so do trial runs, and then they'd say, oh my gosh, no, we gotta, now that we see what happens to us, we've got to change our energy policies.
That sounds excellent. I wish we could have this sort of simulations for everybody, because sometimes you really need to show people the impact of their decisions, not even in the far future. We're talking about 10, 20 years here. It's not even that far. But most people, if they don't see it, it just doesn't exist.
And some of them were, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So a few students were overly optimistic because Lev, if I remember right, in a few cases, the rainfall increased for a very few number of countries. So they actually increased productivity. So they're like, so some students were like, well, sure, that's going to be us, or, so anyway, they ignored all the negative, saw one minute chance of the positive and ran with it.
Well, and I would imagine that in a field like yours, the things globally about consequences that individuals make or individual countries make, it's true that some countries may actually get better. I mean, even with climate change as we know it, places that are deserts are not going to be deserts, but that's just because places that are not deserts are going to become deserts. So it's, if you think locally, yeah, you may be one of the few lucky ones that actually gets better, but a lot of the other ones are going to get worse. And thinking about this global perspective is really important, and something that scientists, I think, are fairly good at, because we kind of see, especially geoscientists, we kind of see Earth as one thing. It's not one part of Earth, it's one planet. And so we have to think of it in a very global way.
I agree. And the students, the nation format, I even teach this aspect in my class, is outdated in terms of it plays, obviously people are, where internationalists rise, so the nation seems very important for group identity and security, but for policy and reality, and even if you start thinking of multinational corporations that sort of cross borders and aren't held accountable, so it becomes less analytically useful the more you look at it. Besides, corrupt authoritarian leaders that want to, foment nationalism. Very useful for that.
Exactly, that little aspect that we prefer it wouldn't exist, but unfortunately it's there.
Right.
So you've had experience so when you talk about how scientists and politicians communicate, you actually have experience that's relevant here, and you've actually observed how this happens, and that it's apparently horrifying.
Yes, prior to coming to ASU, after I got my PhD, I ended up sort of staying in Arizona, and it worked out that I worked for it's called the Auditor General's Office. Think of it as a nonpartisan research branch of our state legislature. In the US, if any scientists are familiar with it, the GAO does the same thing for Congress. So when Congress wants to know sort of just the facts about an issue, they send off the GAO, and then they come and testify. So we would write reports for our state legislature. And to one of Fabio's earlier points, and half of which might have a college degree, in terms of the politicians that represent us, they're representing values of people. They're not representing I don't even know, general education levels or policy experts. They aren't the experts. They are the decision makers that are there because of their values. They rely on technocrats to do and legislative staff to sort of know some of the facts. So we were sort of part of that technocratic group. We were sent to research an issue and then testify. When we did, it was pretty horrifying to see. We had to write all our reports at the 7th to 8th grade level, and not just because it's not like all these legislators are unintelligent, but they're very busy. They don't have time. They aren't looking into the details. They want something quick and easy to read. So I learned quickly to present to them in a way that was so clear and direct. And even if I had nuanced data, all of my effort was spent translating that nuanced data to something that was sort of clear, actionable, and as direct as possible. In that process, I would watch other testimony, in particular, a lot of academics. ASU might have something to say about, one of the topics, and their researchers would come. And I saw, unfortunately, eyes roll for the legislator because they weren't even sort of open, in a sense, to the ivory tower coming to lecture to them. But unfortunately, in many cases, they came to lecture to them. So they approached the process of talking to decision makers as one of, they're lost in their own world. So whether it was bad intention or they just were unaware of the situation and the approach they needed to take, their message was completely lost most of the time. So if you imagine, their testimony is particularly valuable for the topic at hand, but they didn't deliver it in a clear, concise way with sensitivity to, like they didn't read their report. They would have assumed that the legislators read more than they really did, and they didn't go the extra mile to convey their message and recommendations to that committee. So yeah, there was a total missed opportunity, a little bit of fault on both sides.
Yep. And I can very easily imagine this happening at every level. I'm curious though, in your sort of experience, when you said you had to learn how to present these facts at 7th and 8th grade level, a lot of scientific results are nuanced and they have exceptions and they are complex. How do you boil down that complexity without an oversimplification that ends up being incorrect?
Oh, it's a good question. There's a process of the review process, so there's sort of a written process and then there's a prep for the oral process. So when presenting, the written process goes through where we have to have our 40-page, let's say, report on topic. Well, that has to include single-page summaries of every section, and then another iteration. So it's almost 4 iterations of the same information distilled into fewer words. And in that review process, some editor is trying to edit it to make it clean and sharp. Well, in so doing, they lost important technical nuances that suddenly made that statement incorrect. So what we'd have to do is look at it again and say, no, we can't say that. So it was an ongoing deliberation about what you can say and for it to be technically accurate. So if you mind, it's sort of like watering down something, but not lying is sort of what I think that's one of the better ways to put it. And similarly, when we'd have to present, we would have to have a 15-minute presentation prepared, and then we'd have to create a 5-minute one and a 3-minute one also, because sometimes you get there and they don't have 15 minutes of time, that you have 5 minutes. So what can you convey in 5 minutes? So that presentation went through the exact same process.
Wow. See, it's curious though that faculty would have, or academics in general would have a hard time doing that, because this is almost the same process that we have to do when we teach upper level courses instead of lower level courses. Obviously, what we say in Bio 101 is correct, but it's not the full picture. The students are not ready to handle all the exceptions and the complexities. When they go to Bio 400, then they can handle that complexity. So that is I guess it's an experience that academics would have, but for some reason they don't see it transferring to other fields.
Yes. Oh, that would have been great prep to have the academics know when you're going in, you're talking to bio prereq or whatever, like not even the 100 level, or so that would be probably, and I also thought, as you were saying, that abstracts that academics have to write all the time is also, but sometimes the abstracts, as you know from writing them, every word matters and it is loaded. And so that meaning could be lost, or not, but I mean, at least it's technically accurate. Yeah.
I find it curious, as you were describing the process of how you construct these reports and then simplify them so that they are digestible in anywhere from 3 to 15 minutes, that it mimics very much the process I've had to take when I've been teaching a lot of students. You mentioned that, they didn't read anything before they came in. They're not listening. They're playing on their smartphones. Like that sounds more like a class. That sounds more like an introductory level classroom. And then I also liked how you described that back and forth, that the editor makes some changes and then you have to correct because some of the nuance has been lost. And to me, that strikes me as very similar to how we've been co-developing the Greenworks curriculum, where I'll take what you've designed for the public policy, simplify it to something I think a scientist can understand, and then you'd have to correct it back because I missed some nuance there that I didn't pick up because public policy isn't my field of expertise.
Yeah, and I'd agree. And that dialogue went the other way, where I'm trying to put like gold mines in open plains, and you're like, well, "What are you doing? They need to be near mountains. Like they can't be, Or I pretend that there's all these impacts. You're like, no, in the real world that wouldn't happen. But I need it. It's just easier. Let me flood them. I don't know."
But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there's probably that same kind of tension when you want to put a gold mine in a place where it wouldn't physically exist because of reality. But then you could also imagine having that same kind of conversation with a politician, where a politician might say, well, I really want this policy because I believe it will work, even if it's unreality. And we see that a lot nowadays, where people have become disconnected with reality. They choose the reality that they want, and then they get very upset when reality kind of smacks them in the face. And trying to have those conversations now is becoming more and more difficult, that no, you may not know everything and you may need to listen to someone who does.
Right. And they definitely don't, they almost treat sort of experts, scholars, scientists as ones that are stopping, like, oh, you're always putting brakes on things I want to do, and you say I can't, and I don't like that answer. We have human ingenuity, so suddenly they speak values, and technocrats, scholars, scientists, they speak facts, right? So that divide is so wide, and they get angry. I've had, when I couldn't confirm that some program had basically negative effects on students, they wanted me to at least say, well, you can't prove that that has positive effects, but at least we're not harming them. And I was like, Madam Chair, Senator, Smith, no, I can't tell you they're not harming. And then they just threw up their hands. They were furious with me. Like, how dare you, like, just say we're potential, you can't confirm. They just didn't like that I wouldn't confirm what they wanted to do.
Yeah. But I do like the fact that you're saying they speak values while the experts, let's say, speak facts, because obviously we as experts get upset with the politicians get upset with us, but both points of view are important, and both points of view need to find a space. And I mean, the values that they are thinking of, they're not coming out of the blue, right? The people want certain changes. The people need certain changes to happen. And so, of course, there has to be some sort of compromise that needs to be reached. And it's always, to me, so surprising and kind of disheartening when it seems like it has to be either one or the other. It seems like the two parties cannot see that there has to be a compromise that need to be reached, because both are valid.
I agree. I hope, and we started to have an understanding when we would work when I would specialize in that same office in school districts, for example, over time, and I think about this with education too, you almost have a long-term deliberation plan. How am I going to absorb what they say, and then reframe what I need to say in their own terms, in terms of that, like what values are being triggered by the results I'm about to tell you, so sort of to prepare for that conversation, but also think of, and I don't mean this as patronizing as it sounds, maybe I do, I'm academic too, but you need to educate them. And so you need to bring them along on certain concepts and maybe choose a couple of like red line in the sands, like bottom line, I cannot make reality, reality is this. And no matter how much you want it to change, I'm telling you this aspect won't change. Maybe there's wiggle room in some other areas, but almost having like a game plan to like, what do I need to do to educate people on this point? Fauci did a little bit of this during the pandemic, I think, a little like sort of taking baby steps in educating people.
I like how you talk about values, because I know for climate change education, and we've discussed this at length because there are some interesting studies that show that increasing science literacy doesn't actually overcome that partisan divide, and it's more related to science curiosity. But I know for a lot of climate science education, for at least the first decade of the century, the approach was, let's just throw more facts at people and then they will accept that they are wrong and that the scientists are right. And it just started to create more and more of this partisan divide. And it turns out the most effective way of reaching people across the aisle on topics that they may disagree with, which could be climate change, it could be gun violence or restricting guns or vaccines, was to talk about shared values, because oftentimes the partisan divide is driven by values, certain values that are more important to one group than to another group, but the values are shared, just potentially not ranked at the same level of importance. And you could start crossing that aisle by connecting to the values, because everyone loves their kids, I'm assuming.
Right. At times, it varies, it goes up and down.
And I think to a certain extent, these values are also shared by the experts, by the scientists. I mean, we, at the end of the day, we all just want to have decent lives, right? I mean, no matter which job we do, we just want to be able to go home to our families, our pets, our whatever interest we have, and just have a decent life. That's kind of what we want. And so talking about that, I think it's useful. And I have seen in colleges, at least in my institution, a shift a little bit towards that. So in my college, for example, we have a system that we call the flags system, where every course is connected to certain skills that are soft skills that the students would gain into that course. And it could be, I don't know, teamwork, it could be leadership, it could be anything that is not necessarily linked to what shape the DNA has, or, you know, what kind of rock this is, but it's linked to how would you apply these soft skills into society. And it seems like that could be a good starting point. But the course that you are teaching, Tara, kind of brings this to a whole other level.
Yes, what a great way of putting that, sort of recognizing the moments of, especially in science, it's almost how else can this be used? What is this? How is this connecting to people, whether it's kids eventually seeking jobs, or I'm sure you have it with any kind of ethical considerations of some of the research, you know, that is done. So sometimes as scientists, we want to appear so objective that we are avoiding some value conversations when they're relevant, even in, you know, sort of very effective, useful, and easy ways that you described. You know, what other skills are they getting, you know, from learning this? And so we could, in our class, we talk both about understanding, you know, the science of climate change, and thanks to Lev, so making it a little, not sort of like climate change as Dr. Lennon feels like it should work for her and her weird power relationships of this game, but, you know, sort of a respect for science and what really happens, and then the consequences for real humans. And the students in the role playing, we've especially found, they hold on to those values. It suddenly becomes all about, protecting themselves, their fictitious nation. Like they adopt a group identity very quickly. And so those values in that way come through. And so you're right. It's a good way for this course to sort of combine a respect for science and a tangible feel of the pull of values.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you mentioned about the identity, because I'm thinking about how we ran this with Brazilian and Ukrainian students in the fall, back in October, November, and some of the Brazilian students within a couple of weeks really got into the role playing. They had their flags up as their background in the lectures, their country's fictional flags. They made up the flags. They reacted aggressively to the nations that were not participating. I've met some of the students now in person, so that's been nice. And it's amusing because I can't see their faces because we're still masked up here in Brazil. And the first thing I asked them was, what country were you a part of? And when they tell me which country they were a part of, I know immediately which student they are. So that's probably not good for me that I started creating those identities for them as well. But it's very effective in engaging them in the experience by giving them identities that they need to protect.
Yes, and fill out those identities. So they get to sort of customize their nation group in a particular way. And so that creative input for active learning, I think and we all know that the active learning style is engaging for students. So, but where that engagement takes them is interesting. And so it's good to form it because it gets them involved. And I remember every one of when I think of every student that I've taught this so many years now, I don't even know how many iterations, but it's somewhere around a dozen to 16 or so. I remember groups by, oh yeah, you're the oligarchy Kurgan from 2016, or something. So.
Yeah. It almost seems like it would be the next evolution of this course would be almost from a psychology perspective, have the students actually have to swap countries so that they have to get themselves into a different position and see, oh, that's how my country was perceived by the other people, kind of help them develop the empathy side of putting yourself into somebody else's shoes.
Oh, that'd be great. And, to switch, we already switched up a little bit. I used to let students choose their group years ago. And so I don't know, maybe the last 3 years or 2 years, we've had it just randomized, more so for simplicity. But there was a logic to also, you don't get to, if you are libertarian, choose to be in the libertarian state. You get to, you have to be, an absolute monarch or something like that. So it does. And there's another sort of psychological point that is in the literature, and one of my earlier studies confirmed it too for this class. Everybody knows the engagement works, but content understood. So if there's content in the course, is it remembered more? And it turns out that it is for active learning classes versus a traditional classroom. So because I teach political ideologies, they were my control group in the study. And so the pre to post in a given semester was similar. That is, you would understand what a socialist system is in both my control group and this class, which was the treatment, right? Sort of the engaged learning. Fast forward a year. So they've been out of the course for a full year. I've emailed them and I get this number of participants. The ones in this course are so engaged that it's almost like it hardwires what is a socialist state in their minds, so that a year later they blew away the control group, the ones that I teach in a big lecture hall, political ideologies, like they've lost that information. And so it was, and this has been confirmed in the literature, that while content mastery isn't necessarily better in active learning at the moment, it retains longer when it's hard linked into your emotional experience in that engaging environment. So that might help us. And I would think in science, so much of it is active learning in the lab and the field, so there might be similar sort of, you get something ingrained in you when your senses are up in the experience.
No, I completely agree. And I know that there is a very strong push to change, especially the intro level courses that are, these giant classrooms are kind of boring. You sit there and listen to the professor talk for 2 hours, change them to active learning activities, at least a part of the time, so that, you actually have to build your own 3D DNA double helix structure, and then you actually remember how the different parts come together. Those kind of things really do help quite a bit. But I'm curious. So I assume the majority of your students are in political science, right? That's their chosen field. How do they react when they are exposed to the science side? Do they like learning about it? Are they exasperated with it? What is their reaction?
It's almost like they see it as, what that's a barrier. Like, how do I get over that barrier? Like, give me some power move. And sometimes, and Lev has probably pulled me back on this, although he's given me, I have my own course, especially with my own students when it's for ASU group versus other ones, I will make judgment calls that, probably are more politically, based versus could you get away with that? Because I'd say, if you invest 200 resources, I'll let you build, those solar plants, so I might not have, and Lev might be like, they don't have the materials, they don't have this, they don't have, so there might be some, so let's see. So the quick answer is they are frustrated by them. They quickly try to find some power play to maneuver around the reality of the science. And so they see it as an obstacle, not as, not as much of a, how do we work with, because sometimes we give them detailed data sheets of these are your emissions, and some dive into them just simply as data. Like they like the idea of, there's a bad polluter, let's go after that country and pressure them. And if they change, we're all good. As opposed to, can we use our own scientific curiosity, come up with a unique plan? So the default is power versus knowledge, I would say, for the vast majority of my political science students.
Sounds a lot like the legislators you were talking about. Yeah. You can't confirm. Why can't you confirm what I think it's already true?
Right. No, so I'm building I'm grooming a bunch of little politicians. And sometimes my class scares me. I have a very roller coaster love-hate relationship with the class. I do love it. At some point, I suddenly hate all the students, and then at the end I like them again, or at least I think fondly of them. But I'm ready for the semester to end because we're all emotionally tied in, and I've been through a lot of their emotional drama related to the class. So yes.
We certainly have some stories to tell on what's transpired in the classes in the past. And I think what's curious is these power moves that students make, because they're often trying to find a shortcut to get to the answer. And I noticed, at least when I was observing the class and helping run the climate change scenario, the students would come to us for the answers. They would come to us and say, what does the data say? What will happen if I do this? And us as the game masters have taken the approach, used to take the approach of, well, if you do this, this will be the outcome. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. There is no game master that can tell the world what's going to happen if you make these decisions. So I think an interesting approach that we're starting to develop, although we're still a bit farther away than I would like, is creating this information uncertainty version of the game where no one knows what the right answer is, including us, the instructors, because it's all kind of powered by a game engine that behaves according to set rules, so that we start mimicking the real world where there is no teacher you can go to get the answer. So how do you think that's going to work out for classes if we ever get that working?
It's I think a natural extension of something I've tried to do on a small scale, where they want to, and this sounds weird, but they wanted to become a nuclear power, and I made them, they wanted to deploy a dirty bomb, one group. And so they needed to get nuclear materials, kidnap a nuclear scientist, and then effectively deploy the bomb. And so one, sort of scheming country had this whole thing that they wanted to do. So I worked with them, and every step was a random number draw, or like a roll the dice, so that yes, I gave them sort of basic steps, but I couldn't tell the outcome. Like you have, and if they failed, they didn't get, whatever the weighted roll the dice, I would expose them to everyone for trying to do this dirty bomb. So they had multiple iterations where it was a random roll the dice that decided, whether they could pursue the next step. So now that's not necessarily reality, but it's a little better than me saying, oh, good, that's a nice idea, and you have money. Okay, it worked automatically, regardless of the 10,000 factors that might actually interrupt your great plan. So I think it would be wonderful to have to deal with that uncertainty in a more concerted way.
Excellent. So basically converting the class into Dungeons and Dragons.
That's it. There's a reason why Dungeons and Dragons is popular, especially for people and I imagine it's popular among scientists,
Very much so. Right. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was a very illuminating discussion.
So happy to be here. Great to chat with both of you. And yeah, love the topic, and I'm excited to hear all the podcasts.
So, Lev, you have worked with Tara for quite a while now. What have you learned from this conversation that you didn't already know, since you worked with her for so long?
I think I learned more about the legislative process, and I'm surprised at how preparing materials for discussion and for consumption by legislatures, how it mimics the preparations I need to do for an introductory level class. I think a lot of scientists have the assumption that they are high functioning professionals, that politicians are high functioning professionals as well. But they're high functioning professionals often in terms of different values and different motivations, in which case it's not a matter of one technocrat talking to another technocrat. It's a technocrat talking to someone who's considering many more options than just what does the data tell me. And they're also thinking about, what do I need to do to get reelected? What do I need to do to make sure Pam down the street doesn't call my phone again to complain? And it's interesting, and I think that is a really important lesson to draw out of this conversation, that treat it like an introductory level lecture, in that maybe the person you're talking to has expertise, but probably not, and there's benefit in simplifying materials down so that you don't lose them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It was very interesting, and to me, it was also very interesting to see the dynamic within of the students within the class, kind of already mimicking what the adults politicians are actually doing, because you can start seeing early on those patterns, and because they are still within the school system, you can sort of teach them how to recognize those patterns, and in some cases either modify them or soften them a little bit so that they are more perceptive to the input from other people. So courses like this that bridge across not just multiple sciences, but across the classic divide of the sciences and the humanities, the sciences and the arts, are really powerful, because they kind of put together the different sides of a human being. I mean, we all have these aspects within us.
Yeah, and I think that's what's been the most fun about working on this project. It's very much, it activates the science part of me, but it also activates the humanities part of me, and the international travel, and why we're doing an international podcast that has 2 international guests so over a season. So
yeah, that is wonderful, and I hope we're going to see more and more of these examples as the colleges and universities develop a more complex approach to education and kind of bridge across the silos of the disciplines.
Yes, and that sound means that it's time for your next meeting. So that's going to be our sign off for this week.
Indeed.
So we will see you next week for our season finale.
See you next week.
Bye, everyone. Music for this episode is The Diplomat by John Philip Sousa from Pixabay.com. You can learn more about the Greenworks program at www.sciencevoices.org/greenworks, including how you can participate. Global.Science is a production of Science Voices, a U.S. nonprofit organization. You can learn more about our work and support projects like Greenworks at www.sciencevoices.org.